I'm also a professor here at Laney and Merritt. I actually graduated from Laney myself, both myself and Imani, and this is my daughter, Kati. And she was just a little girl when I was going to school here. I graduated with African American Studies, my AA in African American Studies. I got my BA in African American Studies at San Francisco State, very radical program in ethnic studies. No, that was in Black Africana Studies. And then I got my MA at San Francisco Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department. So being back at Laney and being a teacher at Laney really means a lot to me. And so I'm really, really happy to be here. Being a lecturer here, I feel like we're always lecturing at students. I'm one of those people that likes to do activities in the class. And I like to use music. Unfortunately, I don't have any speakers to use the music that I brought. But I can tell you a little bit about my process of getting ready for this and kind of narrate the music a little bit so that we can make do with what we have. And as you know, we've always had to make do with what we have, right? But we don't let that stop us. So anyways, this presentation is about the history of economic justice in the civil rights struggle, right? And I think that there's a lot of hidden information about the civil rights struggle overall. I can go into a whole diatribe about how nonviolence was not the only method used to get things done. I can go into a diatribe about several different parts of the civil rights struggle that are hidden. Today we're going to talk a little bit about economic justice and how, you know, people who had certain ideologies, that part of them has been hidden from them, right? But I think that it's important for us to understand these ideologies from an experience sense instead of just something in the past. Whenever I teach history, I'm not teaching history to tell you what happened in the past. I'm teaching you history so that you can learn what's going on in the present, right? So you can use whatever resistance methods we have used to be able to resist in this time. Now, one of the things I always say to my class is, you know, well, quite often especially in my classes when I'm talking about slavery, I talk about how people will say, you know, well, if that wouldn't happen to me, I wouldn't let no slave master do nothing to me, right? They always say that, right? But I always say, you know what kind of slave you would have been then by what kind of slave you are now, right? Are you the one over in the back room meeting with folks trying to get out of what we got on this plantation? Are you sitting up there complaining and not saying much, not doing much, not planning, not organizing? So history, I feel like we have to look at history within that perspective, okay? So the first thing I want to do, well, let me just tell you a little bit about the process. So whenever I do this, like I said, I like to do activities, right? Something to do, some kind of music. So I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about, you know, how do I get across? I didn't know exactly who was coming. I think I might just let this go for now. I didn't know exactly who was coming, so I wanted to get like a cross-section, make sure that I caught different audiences from different time periods, right? So I was thinking about the music that I love, and I was thinking about hip-hop, because I figured most of y'all like hip-hop, right? Anybody like hip-hop? For the most part? Yeah? So I was thinking most of y'all like hip-hop, and y'all think hip-hop is yours. But really, my age group, 30s and over, hip-hop is ours. I feel like it's ours, right? One of the things we want to think about is when we're talking about Black history, it's always been a question of freedom, right? It's always been about how do we get free, right? But one thing we want to ask ourselves is, what is freedom in a capitalist society, right? What does that really, really look like? What has been your experience? We just went through how an indigenous society might deal with each other. How do you see, tell me about how we deal with each other in this society. It's all about money, right? Everything's about money. People will backstab you, right? I mean, does anybody have this experience? People backstab you, people talk about you, you lose friends over money. I remember when I was living in Lower Bottoms, two people living right next to each other, they had known each other, I swear, like 15, 20 years. One didn't pay the other one back $300, and his son went and killed him, right? Over $300, right? These types of things happen all the time, right? Even a lot of us, you know, like when I was saying I'm just trying to function, right? I feel like I don't really live in a free society, in a capitalist society, right? Because I'm just trying to function. So this was the picture of the Ohlone people. I don't know if you can see it, but you can clearly see they're very dark, right? They look like African people. And after, I'll put it up if you'd like to look at it again. But you can see the African influence here in the United States. But that's from before. So the one thing we want to think about is there was other situations just like ours where people were feeling some type of way, right? They didn't like slavery. They didn't like any of those things going on. But people didn't just feel some type of way about those things. They actually did action or did some type of action, right? And so the civil rights is commonly understood in three major ways, okay? One big way that we always think of the civil rights movement as a racial justice story, right? And that's only, I would say, a small fraction of it. It was so much bigger than that and so much wider than that, right? And so we want to consider what were the other underlying trends and what was going on at that time. Quite often it's taken out of context. People don't realize that the civil rights movement, for many people, was considered an African freedom movement, meaning it was a part of the African liberation movement that was happening all over the world, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And people see it outside, I said that wrong, but also we want to look at it as the African freedom movement within the United States, right? That there was a long movement, and even Dr. Wilkinson yesterday at the Black History Month presentation, he talked about the long civil rights movement, that it's kind of interesting for us to even say that the civil rights movement started around the 50s and ended around the 60s or 70s. Because from the time the first European landed in Africa and tried to take slaves or tried to colonize, Africans have resisted, right? They have always wanted their civil rights. We never went. If you ever look at all the pictures, you see pictures of people with stuff around their neck. That's because they didn't want to go, right? And so he talked about this being the long civil rights movement really started back in Africa. And we tend to see this outside of the socialist world struggle, right? So the African freedom movement, if we really think about the African freedom movement, and one of my favorites, Harriet Tubman, right? Did Harriet Tubman just escape to freedom? What'd she do? She went back lots of times, right? She went back lots of times. She helped to free lots of enslaved Africans. She never gave up. She fought in the Civil War. She was in the cuts planning stuff, right? She had her gun. She was armed. She was ready. Hey, if you went with her and you decided to get scared and run back, you wasn't going to get out, right? Because she was so focused on making sure that the people had their freedom that she made sure that everybody thought about it in terms of the whole, right? Even if we race forward, right? I'm not going to be able to go through, how people were kind of socialist from the beginning, right? But just even racing through and looking at this idea of Pan-Africanism, right? Pan-Africanism is generally a socialist type movement. Now, what do I mean by socialist? What do you think? Or an African socialist movement? What might that mean? Or what have you been told that means? Nobody knows what socialism is? Is it good or bad? Okay, good ideals, but it doesn't work out. Who told you it didn't work out? Are you talking about capitalism?
No, communism, communism.
Oh, because that sounded like capitalism.
I mean, yeah, the two.
I'm just saying, that kind of sounded like capitalism.
Yeah.
Right? Right? Well, I don't know that it's identical, but basically if you think about what is capitalism, they try to give you all these things. They try to demonize it, tell you this, the worst thing ever. You live under a dictator. It's a war. It's all that, right? Capitalism at its simplest, socialism at its simplest sense, and I'm talking about an African-centered socialism, at its simplest sense, is democratic control of the economics, right? So what is it? Y'all looking at me blank. Democratic control of the economics. What does that mean?
It means everybody gets to say what's happening.
Right. Everybody gets a say in what's in how the social system and the economic system is run. Now, you can't, just like you can't judge Christianity by the Christian, you can't always judge socialism by certain situations. But there have been situations where socialism has worked out, and countries like the United States, who are capitalists, go in and mess that up, right? So I'm going to kind of get there a little bit. But what I wanted to do is look at Pan-Africanism, this idea of democratic control of the economics, democratic control of how people are able to do things in their lives, right? So Marcus Garvey is one of the biggest Pan-Africanists, right? You guys have heard, I hope, of the UNIA, which was a major organization. Well, they had the Black Cross nurses, right? Black Cross nurses were people who came together, they trained other women, and they were there to be nurses and give medical care to the people for free. Right? That's kind of democratic control. It's very similar, right? The African Redemption Fund, they were trying to raise $4 million to be raised from the Negro people all over the world to set Africa free and to set the race industrially, socially, and politically free, right? So they were earning money, gathering money to come together, and these are people in the African diaspora, like the Americas, trying to find a way to free Africa. It wasn't about themselves, right? It was about everybody. Here's the Black Star Line. People talk about the Black Star Line. People know what the Black Star Line is, right? Hoping, right? It was a whole... Oh, okay. Uh-huh. Right, the Back to Africa movement. And the Back to Africa movement had, the plan and a grouping of ships, right, that were to be used for trade. That trade wasn't just to be used for individual wealth and gain. That was to help the people. Even the nurses, right, they were planning on there being some sort of African revolution, okay? And so they needed those nurses, once that African revolution to happen, right, a real revolution like with a war, they needed those nurses to be able to help the soldiers, right? So they were planning, right? So when people think about the civil rights movement, so I totally raced, just so you know, I totally raced because I got to get to what we call the height of the civil rights movement. But there were several people before that, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. There's just so many people who, if you really look back into it, they were basically socialist minded, right? So when we think about the civil rights movement, quite often we think about boycotts, right? And boycotts are an economic way of forcing someone to do what you want, or a group of people to do what you want, right? So a lot of times when we think of those boycotts, we think of people not shopping places, taking their money away. We also think of people, sitting in and saying, you're going to serve us, so we want to be able to shop in your stores. We want to be able to be served in your establishment, right? But a lot of people don't know that. And who's heard of the Deacons for Defense? Huh? Okay, Deacons for Defense. These were, now a lot of people say that Martin Luther King was, totally nonviolent. But when I think it was it A. Philip Randolph? I'm not sure which guy went to his house. Oh, Baird Rustin. Yeah, Baird Rustin went to his house and almost sat on a gun, right? And they had to kind of convince him. And it wasn't something that he was totally into. And the majority of the South was not nonviolent in their lives. They chose nonviolence as a strategy to be able to shame basically the white supremacists. Now it gets much deeper than that. But the Deacons for Defense were this group who would protect the protesters quite often. But they also had another function. They had a group of them called the enforcers, right? The enforcers would, when they would have a boycott, right, some kind of boycott, or quite often it was about jobs, right? They wanted to be able to be hired in different, they wanted black people to be hired in different businesses. If someone crossed the line of the boycott, someone black crossed the line of their boycott, they would get a visit from the enforcers, right? It wasn't a nice visit, right? They would make sure that that boycott stuck, kind of like Harriet Tubman, because they knew what was at stake, right? So they got a visit from, if it was women, they got a visit from women. If it was men, they got a visit from men, right? But their success rate was damn near 100% when they had the enforcers involved, right? So you can see how economics gets involved there, right? And the other thing is to look at even if you look at this picture, it's not just about being able to shop, it's about jobs. The right to have a job, the right to survive, the right to eat, right? The right to have medical care, right? All of those things. Now, like I said before, quite often people don't recognize that there was an African liberation movement that was happening, right? I think within a few years, in the 50s and 60s, like a tremendous amount of African countries got their independence. And quite often, they were socialist countries, right? And so this is Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Is that right? Yeah, of Kenya. And, ooh, I got to remember I can't touch that. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Malcolm had a visit with him and several other African liberation movements, right? And so that cross-pollination where, you know, activists were talking, you know, African liberation activists of those African countries, they got together, and then here you have Malcolm who comes, who has this really radical sense, right? And they got together that had profound effects. Here's Malcolm's words about towards the end of his life about what this world struggle was about. He said it really wasn't a racial conflict of black against white or a purely American problem. Rather, what we are today seeing is a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter, right? Very kind of socialist sounding terms that we don't want to be exploited, constantly exploited. You can't have capitalism without racism. You can't operate a capitalistic system unless you are vulturistic. You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist. These are Malcolm's words, right? He felt it necessary for his people to consider socialist solutions to their problem, right? He told the OAAU, the Organization of African American Unity, to consider socialism because, as he said, that was the system that the new independent countries in Africa and Asia and even Scandinavia were using to get rid of poverty and provide a decent life and a decent education for everyone, right? And there's him with, you know, the ultimate demon, right? Castro, right? Your boy, Martin, right? Everybody thinks he was all about love and all of that. It wasn't that simple. Or maybe we could say it is that simple. That if you really think about it, caring for someone else and making sure someone you don't know has medical care, making sure someone who's lazy has medical care or can eat, maybe that's an ultimate act of love. Right? Mama Coretta, his wife, right? She said that Martin Luther King was the first Negro she ever met who claimed to be a democratic socialist. He even wrote her a letter, a love letter in 1952. I'm not going to go through the whole love letter, but in there he said about capitalism, he failed to see its relative merits. He then said, I am more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Okay? Martin Luther King also independence struggle of Ghana, they had a big shindig. Most independence struggles did, right? And Kwame Nkrumah was the leader of Ghana at the time, and he was definitely an African socialist. And you can see that Martin Luther King showed up to that. That's him and Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, right? So you see that a lot of this stuff is hidden. Has anybody heard this before? Right? Martin Luther King is the one who's on every capitalist advertisement that you can see, right? He said capitalism is and this is Martin Luther King's words himself, capitalism is a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. You know he liked to rhyme, right? And since we don't have, I had a little clip, but since we don't have good sound, I'm not going to play that clip. But if you want to, you can write down, well, I'll give it to you after. But even if you search in Google, you search Martin Luther King land, he talks about land, and he talks, there's a little clip, it's like maybe 2-3 minutes, right, where he talks about land and economics and this idea of sharing, right? Also, a lot of people don't know that towards the end of his life, he really changed his stance in many different ways, right? And one of those ways was he really started to embark on a poor people's campaign. The plan was, and in that little clip, Kathleen Cleaver from the Panthers talks about how the plan was to march to Washington and to camp out on the lawn for poor people. Right? He was even involved in some sanitation strikes. It wasn't just about racial justice. It was about economic racial justice, right? And so a lot of people think that might have been one of the things that pushed the American government over to assassinate him, right? And so, of course, they have their idea of who assassinated him. I'm not saying who assassinated him, but I'm just saying a lot of people think that it was the American government, the CIA, who assassinated him, right? Another person.
We're going to demand our check.
What'd you say?
That speech about a month before he died.
Right.
Says we're going to march to Washington.
That's the
our check.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the clip that I have, right? Where he's saying we want our I want to say SHIT, but we want our stuff. We want it in our hand. We want it now. You gave it to everybody else. He talks about it. You gave it to everybody else, but you didn't give it to us. We deserve that, right? So he talks about that. Does anybody know who this is? What time? Replaying. Do you guys said Harry Belafonte, right? Harry Belafonte. A lot of people don't know that he is pretty much even in his younger days when he was touring, he was quite often in communist and socialist circles, right? And he has said and supported Hugo Chavez, who was a socialist, right? So way back in the day, though, there was the SNCC organization. Does anybody know who SNCC is? Y'all better know who SNCC is. Right, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Everybody knew that, right? Y'all knew that, right? Say yes. Yes. Okay? But the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was the ones doing the sit-ins, right? The ones you see, did you see the movie I hate, The Butler, right? Where people were sitting in and they were getting stuff put on them. And I think SNCC also did they do the Freedom Rides, or maybe that was CORE. But Harry Belafonte, in I think it was 1967, actually arranged and paid for a group of people. Huh? Oh, that's an Amber Alert? Oh, is there any kids in here? Check that after, definitely. If it was my kid, I want you to check it. So anyways, he actually arranged for 11 SNCC members to go to Africa. In that group was Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Fannie Lou Hamer actually was in the delegation to go to Africa, got a chance to sit down with African activists, right? Another couple people, John Lewis. John Lewis is now a senator, right? Congressman, right? Is now a congressman. He was a part of SNCC at that time. Bob Moses, You know, I kind of assumed that y'all would know some of these people, but they were major organizers within the SNCC organization. Also, Julian Bond. This isn't a great picture of him, but it's him standing with a bunch of people. He was also in that, but he's pretty famous for the work that he did in the civil rights movement. Also, James Foreman, who's like, his book was really what got me started in this, The Making of a Black Revolutionary. He considered himself a revolutionary, black nationalist, and socialist. He was very clear about that, right? He was also in the Black Panther Party and the Internationalist Black Workers Congress, right? So these people that we're talking about, these are people, when you read the history books, you will come across their names quite often, right? And a lot of them either were socialist or turned socialist, right? Another person I hope you all recognize is Kwame Ture, or what they called him at that time was Stokely Carmichael, right? Stokely Carmichael was the, if you ever seen the film where he was like, what do we need? Black power, right? That's the dude that everybody credits with saying black power. There's some debate about it because there's debate about everything. But he's the dude that's credited with black power. He was also in SNCC. Now he wasn't on that that particular trip, but he did take several trips to Africa where he spent lots of time with African activists who were also in African socialist movements for change, okay? And so, so you see him there. And so after they got a chance to really travel, they came back, and one of the things that they said is, we identify ourselves within the African struggle as a concern for all mankind, right? Here's another statement, May 1967, right? And I'm going to read it because I thought it was going to be bigger. But in our staff meeting held during the past week, the organization voted that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is a human rights organization interested not only in human rights in the United States, but throughout the world. That in the field of international relations, we assert that we encourage and support the liberation struggles of all people against fascism, exploitation, and oppression. We see our struggle here in America as an integral part of the worldwide movement of all oppressed peoples, such as in Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Latin America. Furthermore, we support the efforts of our brothers in Puerto Rico who are presently engaged in a fight for independence and liberation there. So there is this, you can see there's this cross-pollination going on. People are traveling, they're meeting other groups, right? And their economic philosophies are changing, right? 5 minutes? Okay. So I'm kind of moving through it because I want to get to the end. Now, who's heard of the Black Panther Party? If anybody doesn't know, they're getting a whooping. Okay? Who's heard of the Black Panther Party? Raise your hand high. I'm searching. Okay, nobody gets a whooping today. The 10-point program of the Black Panther Party. Sometimes we hear about this guns and all that other kind of stuff, but they had a clear economic program. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our black community. We want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true da-da-da-da-da. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to the police brutality and murder of black people. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in a court by a jury of their peer group. We want land, bread, housing, education, food, justice, and peace. We have, and it basically talks about we have the right to our own destiny. These are all economic platforms, right? So we have had an economic plan from all throughout history, from the very beginning when we were in that circle and we were deciding that we wanted to put people over things, all the way down. And each of you in this room, when you decided, if you ended up on that side of the room, your value system is closer to socialist than it is to capitalist, right? And so that means that, we have to realize where we're living, what we're doing, how we're dealing with each other. I can, once I know, or once I learned what capitalism was and what socialism was, you know, I have to deal with things different. When I get my money, it's not always just mine. I have to make sure everybody's taken care of, right? And we kind of naturally do this, I would say. You know what I'm saying? That means that I don't give, you know, super judgment to the person on the street that's homeless, right? It means that I take the judgment out of what I do and change how things are. The next question, when we're looking at people from the past and what they've done, when we're looking at who we originally were and how we dealt with each other, right? When we look at those things, how do we go from feeling some type of way to changing the economic conditions of our people in this current time, right? And how do we, within that, maintain an African-centered mindset of caring and providing for all and not just the few, right? That's where we want to go. We all, I swear, I can complain to you all day about the stuff that makes me feel some type of way, about all the economics that makes me feel some type of way, right? But until we decide what kind of slaves we are today, and we decide that we're going to be the Harriet Tubman that's meeting in the corner trying to change things, we will be exactly where we are at tomorrow as the same place as we are today. So I hope that out of this talk that you get to a point where you transition yourself from feeling some type of way to doing some type of action.